Harry Sweets Edison was a special guest trumpeter.
Sorry, that name means nothing to me.
He was one of the original trumpeters in the Basie band back in the 30s. So, yeah.
And they still play that same kind of style?
Yeah, well, see, they've kept the charts. The charts is the heart of the band, right? So they kept all the charts. So they've got the book.
Well, the charts and the performance history, because, you know, the charts are one thing, but it's the human thing that you bring to the playing of those charts, which
the
is...
lineage is there, and you know, everybody in there has got major chops. They're and
some of the best, right?
And it's thrilling if you've never experienced it. We were in a small theater at KCSM's campus called the Little Theater, only holds about 400 people. We were about 5 rows up in the orchestra, so we were about level with the stage because it actually comes down below the stage. And when the band came up on this one number called Blues and Haas Flat, every cavity in my body was vibrating with the music, and it was literally a thrilling moment. My body was thrilled. I was like, "Oh my God, this is amazing!" You know, just because the sound just washes right through you. It's not at all like listening to headphones. I mean, it's a full body experience, you know, and it's not loud like amplified electric music. This is a horn section that stands up, and this wall just comes washing over you, and you're like, whoa.
But that's what
live jazz is all about.
it's about, a whole band
The whole band.
playing together, you know, to create this band member, you know, if you've got band members who are competing with one another, it isn't going to sound very good. It's about that playing together as a single unit. That's, yeah, good jazz music. When you see good jazz, it's not like nothing else.
You should rent, you got Netflix, you should rent, actually you can download it instantly, Ken Burns' jazz series.
Oh.
If you haven't seen it, it's phenomenal. It's just, you'll learn so much. You'll know who Harry Sweets Edison is by the time you're done. All right, let's get this road on the road.
So Ken, what do you do?
What do I do? My favorite thing to do is to talk. And, we need to do breath work with you, David?
And breathe.
So my favorite thing to do is to get people talking. I came to this because I'm fairly concerned about what's going on in the world. It looks like it's a really unique time in history, that humans are going through a dramatic change at every level. And there's indications we may actually be waking up as kind of a global species. And about almost 20 years ago, I heard a man ask a group of people, what's the greatest challenge facing humanity today? And there's a long list everybody knows about, you know, war and nuclear waste and, you know, loss of habitat and loss of diversity and extinction and pollution and population. So, you know, those are all really, really big challenges, but they're all secondary, because until we can sit in the same room with other people who have very different ideas than we do and listen to those ideas, and when we disagree with them, not resort to violence to have our way, and not leave because we don't get our way, but to actually hang in there and find something new, we won't make any headway on those challenges. And that's sort of a lightning bolt moment in my life where I just said, oh my God, you know, the power of conversation is phenomenal. And so that was about almost 20 years ago, and I spent the last 20 years studying the role of conversation in human communities and human organizations, and how to talk together effectively to make things happen where people decide what it is they want to have happen and then walk through the steps to make that happen. So conversation is my thing.
At one level, it seems ridiculous that that seems like the most straightforward thing in the world to do, that we can talk to one another, decide what we're collectively going to do, and then figure out ways of having it happen, or of doing it. And yet, it's not really an experience that I've had in my life of being in those kinds of situations where this happens. Generally, in organizations, it's far more, I don't know, it doesn't work like that. I mean, what's your...
I've noticed that. I learned most of what I've learned and most of what I know comes from observing where we have breakdowns. And by breakdown, I simply mean that there's an interruption in flow. We say we want to get to point A, and we take 2 steps and find out that we've got something going on that prevents us from getting there. So breakdown can be positive, negative. It just means interruption in flow. So by paying attention to where people's ability to coordinate their meaning and their action in conversation breaks down, you can begin to remedy that and start to model something different. So, you know, the other thing you say is that you're describing something that's simple but not easy. The essence of the work that I do is getting people with diverse ideas to come together, talk about what's meaningful to them, explore what's possible, and then coordinate their collective action to make something happen, and then to learn and reflect on what happened so that they can, next time around, do something even better.
Right.
So that's really simple, but it is not easy. And this distinction between simple and easy is something that eludes most people. We think simple means easy, and it doesn't. I study martial art called Qigong. I have a teacher who's been practicing for 35 years in the particular form that he teaches me. He can make a very simple move that looks really easy. When I try it, I discover that it's not easy, because he's done it thousands of times, and I'm trying it for the very first time, and it's really hard to coordinate, to get my brain to send the right signal to my muscles and my breath and my eyes and have everything flow into one thing. There's a lot of coordination going on behind the scenes. So yes, it's simple, but it's not easy. And the same thing with human beings in conversation. It's very simple, but it's not easy.
So, yeah, we were talking earlier, and you were telling me the story about when you worked at Santa Cruz, that I think, did some work with UC Santa Cruz, right?
Yes.
That really, I think, exemplifies what it is that you're talking about. And I'd love to hear that story again.
Okay. So this was, I think, back in 2002, 2003. So fairly early in my career as a facilitator at that point. I was invited to come down to UC Santa Cruz by the ombuds person there. And what's going on is that California has had an ongoing budget crisis, and so they were looking for ways to save money at the university, and they discovered that there were 24 separate IT departments. And they said, okay, we'll consolidate you into one department. Well, that affected about 250 people, and in true power struggle form, the chancellor made the announcement, and there was no more information forthcoming. So the conversations that keep those departments going lit up like wildfire with, what's happening? How are we going to get through this? You know, I got to protect my headcount. I got to protect my resources. You know, and what are they going to do? What are they going to take from me? And so we walked into a situation where there was a lot of fear and a lot of mistrust and a lot of doubt and a lot of not knowing, a lot of uncertainty. And my team, which was myself and the ombuds person and another colleague of mine who does graphic facilitation, we met and decided the first thing we wanted to do was to bring together the 24 department heads. So we brought them together for a day of what's called World Cafe, which is a specific process where people sit at tables of 4 and they talk about, the whole room talks about the same question at each table for a set period of time, then they get up and rotate and go to new tables. So we do that a couple of times and kind of harvest the room and see what's going on. Well, it was the first time in history of the organization that all 24 department heads were in the same room together, which is fairly, again, it's one of those things that seems very obvious that you would have happen, but it had never happened. So it goes back to what you point out about organizational thinking. You know, they don't think about getting those folks together. And what we did was we wanted to begin by grounding them in something that was meaningful and important. So we asked them, why do you work here? You're all very skilled IT professionals, and you can go right over the hill into Silicon Valley and find high-paying jobs. Why are you here at UC Santa Cruz? And that grounded them in a lot of passion. You know, we heard things about how they were committed to helping young people, and UC Santa Cruz is a world-class organization. You know, they've got huge grants that come in for some. They've got Nobel Prize winning professors there. There's a lot of research that goes on. People were very passionate about the school and their role in serving and the community, and so it gave them a really solid foundation. You know, I like to use an appreciative approach when I work with people. I don't want to go in and start to stir up a hornet's nest. So then we asked them, okay, what are all your concerns about the merger, you know, of all these, the consolidation effort of all these departments? That's when the hornet's nest opened up. And what came out of the harvest was a huge number of points where people were they were really concerned. They didn't know what was going to happen. They were, you know, very upset. They felt that there wasn't enough support for them to actually make this happen. And it was a moment where there was a lot of anxiety in the room. Mm-hmm. So then it was time once again to kind of ground them back, and we said, all right, so what do you do that's world class here, that if it's not part of the new organization, there's no point in even attempting it? And that kind of put them into both a possibility mindset and a reflective mindset, as well as a mindset of operating from real pride and knowledge of we do this well. And so now we had kind of balance back in the room again. Then I said, all right, I'm going to posit to you that everything you do is coordinated through conversation. If I said to you tomorrow that we're going to New York, you wouldn't be able to do anything if you didn't ask me a lot of questions like, who are we seeing, why are we going, how long will we be there, who's paying for it, you know. So you're going to walk out of here today, and your people in your departments are going to come back to you, and they're going to say, well, so what? What's happening? You know, what's going on? And they're going to have a lot of questions for you, and you're not going to know how to answer them. So if we can identify the core questions that are most important for you to answer as far as moving forward goes, because you're the heads of the departments, you know what needs to be addressed, then that would be very useful. Well, the underestimated part of that was I didn't know how long it was going to take to sort those through. That was about a 3-hour conversation. And we ended up with about 120 questions, which was way too many to deal with. So we gave people dots, 1 red dot and 3 blue dots. And we said, go up here, take a half-hour break. During the break, go up here and put the red dot next to the most important question. And then you have 3 other dots so you can get the next 3 questions after that. And what that revealed to us was kind of a map, a roadmap of the conversations that would be engaged over the coming months. And from 120 questions, you went down to 16 critical questions that all of the managers, based on all their years of experience, had consensus on, that these 16 questions are the most important ones for us to start to address. And so we knew that's what's got to happen here. In the next 4 to 6 weeks, we've got to start to get answers to these questions. And then the next level of questions with the, you know, that were weighted and rated by the dots, gave us the next set of guiding questions for probably the next 3 months after that. And the ones that didn't get any dots on them were still important, but they were further out on the time horizon. So in a single day, we went from mass confusion and a lot of not knowing into a conversation that was very structured and very carefully prepared and planned, where at the end of the day, people felt like they had done really good work, and they knew what was important to them, and they knew what the direction was needed to head, and they knew what the questions were needed to begin to engage. And that kind of set the tone for the whole process. It took about 16 months. It involved over 250 people. There were several more cafe conversations. But that one was sort of the template that we used when we talked to the students, when we talked to the entire IT department, when we talked to the administrators and the professors. We kept asking them questions like that, of, you know, what's really important and what are the questions that you have. And as a result, I think there were only 7 positions lost in the consolidation. There were more positions that didn't get funded, but people took early retirement. So I think only 7 people out of 250 got laid off. And I want to just put one point in here for the chief information officer there. He was from Canada, and he was very committed to making this work for people. There was tremendous leadership there. I can only take so much responsibility for influencing those conversations, but Larry Merkley, who was the head there, just did an amazing job and got people to trust him, and so the degree to which that was successful rests mostly on his shoulders.
Yeah, it's interesting that trust is a very key component within organizations that either are working or are having problems. And it seems that trust is one of those, really one of the core aspects that you need to be able to make change happen. Because when we were talking before about let's have a look, which one?
Well, let me speak to that while you look at the
Okay.
question. There was one moment, we were running this cafe for about 200 people. We had most of the entire IT organization there. And a woman raised her hand when we had an open period for questions, and I brought her the microphone, and she said, you know, I've been here for over 20 years, and I've seen a lot of stuff come and go. I was here when we decided to get rid of the cray. The cray is still here. I was here when business process reengineering came, and they made a lot of changes, and they're gone, and those changes didn't last. I was here when we did TQM, and they made a lot of changes, and those changes didn't last. And why is this going to be any different than any of the other things that we've tried in the 20 years I've been here? And Larry, this man I just was talking about, to his credit, he stood up and he said, you know, I accept responsibility for the level of mistrust of the senior management and leadership, because we have failed in the past, which was huge for someone to stand up and admit that. And he said, and the reason this is going to be different is you'll notice that in all those other efforts, we hired teams of experts to come in and survey and analyze and then make recommendations that we rolled out from the top. And you guys didn't get any input. You might have been surveyed and interviewed what's going on, but you were never asked for how you thought things should be different. The reason this is going to be different is because we're asking you now. We know the success of this effort will not work unless everyone who is affected has the opportunity to say how it's going to affect them and how they want to see it. Now, we cannot guarantee that every single person who makes a suggestion will be able to incorporate their suggestion, but I can guarantee that if you have a suggestion, if you have a comment, if you want to give feedback, we are completely 100% open and asking you for it. And if you don't feel comfortable in this venue, you can come to my office. If you don't want to see me in person, you can send an anonymous email. There's lots of ways, but we know that the only way this is going to work is if everybody has the chance. And we know there's still going to be mistakes, but we're trying to make fewer mistakes. And there was a palpable shift in the room at that moment, because people went, huh, maybe this guy's actually going to do something different that we haven't seen. And so it was a moment where there was more trust and also a level of hope that popped up at the same time.
That's very important. And then, and that's a situation, obviously a very high tension situation, when, because as you were saying, there was a lot of fear that came into the room when there is competition between all those different parts of an organization trying to jostle for resources at some level. So how do you find that working in high conflict situation, is that something that you like to do?
You had to get that conflict piece in there, right? So
conflict is good.
conflict is good. Or you know, I think it was O Sensei, the founder of Aikido, said conflict is either good or bad, it just is, you know. And I like, when I'm talking to people about conflict, I'll say, how many people here are married or in a committed relationship? And I get a lot of people raising their hands. And I'll say, now how many of you have relationships that are conflict free? And I've yet to see anybody raise their hand for that one. So conflict is a very creative and necessary part of life, and it does not have to be bad. It can be bad if we've had bad modeling, you know, which almost everyone I know did, and I certainly had bad modeling growing up. You know, it took a long time to find ways to work this. There's a book called The Conflict Competent Leader that I'm very fond of, and it's interesting because I've never actually read the book, but I listened to the authors on a telephone call, and they've identified 5 levels of conflict, and the first 4 are all pretty reasonable and things that people can deal with on their own, and the 5th one is polarization. And polarization is something where there's so much anger and mistrust between the parties that there's genuine and often open animosity and hostility. And I don't go into those situations. I don't hold myself up as someone who is a facilitator for that type of thing. I recommend you get a mediator for that. But the other 4 levels are very interesting, and you know, they range from simple misunderstanding because there was a miscommunication to differences of perception Pretty much everybody has seen that slide of the old woman, the young woman. You know, you look at it one way, which I just learned recently. It was developed by a professor at Harvard whose name was Boring. I think it was David Boring. Right? So the boring stuff, you know. And then there's differences of opinion and differences of meaning. And this is where we can start to get into some levels of feeling our personal sense of being is threatened. And so that comes into what I call doing inner homework realm of why is it that I'm so attached to this position, that when I sit with someone who's got a different position, that I can't allow myself to open up and really listen to what they have to say. This is a significant step in personal development and in maturation to be able to do this. I was recently at sadly, I was at a memorial event for a friend of mine. He passed away last year, and he sat on the Water District Board, and he was a member of the Sierra Club, and everyone who spoke about him at his memorial service said, you know, he was one of the most open-minded people I ever met. He never compromised his stand around his values and his dedication to keeping the water district green and healthy. But he would come to meetings and he'd say, I don't actually know at the moment where I stand on the desalinization plant. And he would listen to people talk and he'd say, this has been great. As a result of the information today, I've changed my position. I am now more in favor or less in favor of whatever it might be. And to a person, all of his colleagues said they wish that they could be more like that. And I realized that, you know, that's a wonderful example of open-mindedness. We often hear about, you know, I'm going to be open-minded. But how many times can you think in your life where someone's come along and presented something to you that was a challenge to something that was dearly held, a belief that you had for a long time, where you went, wow, based on this new information, I'm changing my mind. I am now going to shift my position. And the amazing liberation that comes from that, of being able to say, I have changed my mind based on new information. Our political system here in the US is not very open to that. They tend to call you a flip-flopper or a waffler if you do that. And yet, if you're going to be innovative and creative and generative, it's kind of a prerequisite. So I'm kind of getting away from your thing about conflict, but I like to reframe conflict as someone is holding another piece of the puzzle for you. And the more you can open up and see that the larger puzzle, the more effective you can be. And we often get very attached to our position because it might come with some perks, some power, some benefits or something. And so there can be a threat. And determining what the actual level of threat is really key being in conversation. Because a lot of times we perceive a level of threat that's not there.
Yeah, one thing that really struck me as you were talking about that was that one of the key aspects of conversation is the ability to listen, to really hear what the other person is saying, so that you can change, discern whether that's how that statement, or whether that statement makes sense to you, and if it does, based upon your experience of the world, then change your mind. You know, realize that there is something that you had not seen. There is something for you to learn about the way things are in the world. It's a learning stance, but it comes from, you need to be able to listen. One needs to be able to listen deeply to be able to do that.
I'd actually expand on that a little bit and say that we are always already listening. We are trained to listen or not from the time we come into the world. As we grow up, our family teaches us what's important to listen to, and school starts to expand on that, and friends, and by the time we become young adults, we've been trained to listen in very specific ways. Very rarely does anybody actually say, I'm going to teach you how to listen to something. And if you do some Google searching, on listening, for example, you'll find that there's this huge number of things that come up around listening to music, and an equally large number of things that come up around pastoral counseling, listening for people who are trying to express some deeper spiritual aspect of themselves. but there's very little out there on the web and in media about just listening in conversation and listening for what's important. And I think this is a kind of a tragedy, actually, that we don't have more solidly grounded processes around listening. We teach people how to listen. I've developed a course on collaboration, and it starts with listening. And I actually tie listening to breath, and I use a combination of an old indigenous Native American process of listening they call listening ears, and Otto Scharmer, who's a fellow over at MIT, who's developed something called the presencing, and his work is in Theory U. And he's described 4 levels of listening. There's listening, what he calls downloading, which is listening from habit. So we do that all the time. You know, we're looking for the things that confirm our view of the world. Oh, hey, great. You know, I really like you. You know, you've got a lot of points of contact with me where we both affirm our views of the world, right? So that's the habit part. And then what he calls listening from the outside, which is, oh my goodness, I just had a conversation with someone whose stance in the world is so different from mine, and their way of looking at the world is so different from mine. It's amazing, and I'm really intrigued because they're a very interesting person, and they seem to really have a lot of good qualities, and I have to open myself up. I have to open my listening and deepen my listening to take in what they're saying and recognize there is a very different way of looking at the world that's equally valid to mine. And then there's another deeper layer of listening that Scharmer talks about, which he calls listening from within. And that's the listening at the empathic level of how does the world show up for this person? What is this person saying underneath their words? You know, what's been their experience? Who are they? And sometimes that has a lot to do with listening to stories as opposed to facts, which are so important because we relate to each other through stories. I'll talk about that in a second because that goes back to conflict. And then the last level of listening that he talks about, which is tied to will, is listening from source. And listening from source is very difficult to describe because it's almost ineffable, you know. And yet it's also really easy to illustrate because you'll hear something that makes the hair on the back of your neck stand up, or you get goosebumps, or your stomach flip-flops, or you just go, yes, you lean forward, yes, yes, you know, because somebody says something that lights you up. And when you hear someone say something that lights you up, that means that the very thing they're talking about is enlivening to the both of you. And that means that it's a source of life, it's a source of growth, of generativity, of innovation. And when you can train your body to be in the states that recognize and are open to those different types of listening, then you can find the sources for creativity, generativity, and innovation much more easily. But they are definitely, they don't come from sitting here and saying, okay, I'm gonna think about listening from source. There's actual physical ways, somatic ways of attuning yourself to that. And if you want to know those, you have to take my course.
We haven't been an oral tradition for quite a while, right?
No, it's been some time. And this actually, David Bohm is often credited with the David Bohm and Krishnamurti sort of birthed the new dialogue movement. In fact, they influenced me greatly because in 1989 I read this story in the Utney Reader about dialogue, and I was very intrigued. David Bohm was a very well-known physicist. He worked on the Manhattan Project, and then he ended up, is that falling down again? he ended up, it's ominous here. There's a little conflict with the weight and the tape here.
Yeah, I think it looks stable, so
All right.
I can edit something together.
Okay, so David Bohm worked on the Manhattan Project, and then he had a falling out with I think, Oppenheimer, and he ended up moving to Britain and spending the rest of his life in the UK. And he was going, in the later years of his life, he was going to these scientific conferences where the exact opposite of my friend Alex saying, as a result of the information I've heard here today on changing my mind, was going on. Instead, some of the world's best educated, most intelligent, smartest people were coming to these conferences, and they were so attached to their positions that when they heard a dissenting viewpoint, they would almost come to blows. And he said, there has to be a better way. And Krishnamurti was a spiritual leader for a lot of people. And the two of them, the scientist and the mystic, came together and they began to explore dialogue and unfolding meaning and how to bring people together. And in his book on dialogue, I think it's in his book on dialogue, Rome talks about oral cultures, particularly the indigenous people here in the U.S. of Turtle Island, used to regularly just seem to know when it was time to get together. And the tribes would come from various places and they would have this big central location. They would all meet, and for over 3 or 4 weeks they would gather and feast and dance and talk. They would spend all day talking. And to the best of my knowledge, from what I've learned of the walking people, which is a little bit of a tradition I've studied, the talk would start with the young people. And then it would move to teenagers, and then to young adults, and then to older adults, to middle-aged adults, to elders. The elders always spoke last. And also, to the best of my knowledge, no one ever sat down and pulled out a strategic planning notebook. And they didn't say, okay, let's actually track all of this stuff. And because they were an oral culture, they had the time and the patience and the listening skills to allow several hundred people to speak and to hold that in their minds. Now, we can't do that anymore in our culture. We don't have the attention span for that, which, interestingly enough, is why I think the World Cafe has appeared. Because the World Cafe is a way for dozens or even hundreds of people to sit in a circle, except now it's a large circle made up of many smaller circles, little individuated cells, if you will, where people can talk and listen. And so we can still get to that level of listening that was part of the older cultures. But Owen was fascinated because at the end of a couple of weeks, they would just know it was time to go, and no one ever said, let's summarize our next steps here. Okay, what's our plan of action? They just talked until they reached a point where balance and harmony was restored, and they would disperse back to their lands until they felt an imbalance and it was time to come back. So that was a very mystical kind of connection between people that came about through talking. And I think that that's part of our collective unconscious. And I think it's actually a part of the collective unconscious that is attempting to wake up. In the last 20, 30 years, we've seen a lot of large group processes: World Cafe, Open Space, Future Search, Appreciative Inquiry, all of which kind of have roots in indigenous oral cultures around how to talk together. And I'm very heartened by this, actually.
Yeah, I mean, this goes, and this is why you call what you do collaborative conversations, because it is that everything, you can't really have a conversation. If it isn't collaborative, it's probably actually not really a conversation. It's an argument or whatever. When you're in conversation, it is about discovering shared meaning or discovering purpose, or it's the people together coming up to some. Not everybody needs be exactly the same in their thinking, but they've all heard everybody else and can understand where everybody is coming from and where everybody is going to. Right?
Well, I'm a word nerd. All right, I love to look at the etymology of words. So, discussion is what the term a lot of people apply to their conversation. We'll have a discussion about this, and if you look at the etymology, you'll find that discussion comes from the same root as percussion and concussion. So it means to bang things together, right? So I think that's one reason why a lot of conversations don't work, is they're discussion-based conversations. It's, I have an idea and I have power and I'm bigger than you, or I am more powerful because I'm higher up in the organization, and we're going to discuss this, but basically I'm telling you how it's going to be. And then we have dialogue, which is dia, which is through, and logos, meaning. So through meaning we will discover how to be together. And then there's conversation, and conversation is from the Latin to turn together. So when we're in conversation, we are turning together to look at something. And I use a circle model. So I'll give you a little bit of the speaking part of my conversation course, my collaboration course, which is to begin by drawing a circle and putting the topic in the middle of the circle and saying, that's what we're going to talk about. So if we decide, hey, we're going to talk about pollution, then everybody who's sitting around the circle gets the opportunity to talk about what pollution means to them. Not what they learned in college about pollution, not what their clergyman or their congressman or their lobbyist or their boss or their neighbor thinks about pollution, but how it is for them personally. Because it's only through personal meaning that we build the relationships that we can really begin to use to make things happen. Otherwise, it's just transaction-based. And collaboration cannot be transaction-based. I'll talk more about that in a minute too. So as we go around and listen to people talk about what pollution means, some people are going to say things that are very idiosyncratic to themselves, and you're going to go, that doesn't resonate with me at all. I don't see it that way. And other people will, but everybody's going to say something that you go, yeah, I get that. I understand what that means. And so when we take the time to listen to what everybody thinks about pollution, we will hear a common set of meanings around pollution, and that's our shared meaning. So shared meaning doesn't mean that we all share the same meaning. It means we all share what's meaningful to us, and then we look for the overlap in that. And that's the basis, our starting point for now that we have meaning, we can explore what's possible. What do we do around this? And most people, don't start from there. Most people start from, here's how it is for me, tell me how it is for you, and then we'll fight together, right? Or we assume that I'm right, you're wrong, or the left and the right have the positions all staked out, and so there's no further conversation. There's so few words that we actually have real agreement on. It's really hard to, it's amazing to me we get as much done in the world as we do, given how little real shared meaning we have. And as we come into the 21st century more and more fully, we're going to find meaning to be really, sorry, that's my phone. Shared meaning is going to be a key part when we look at what's going on with water. So, does every human being have the right to clean water? And if so, what do we do? That's a very big conversation. Water is the next oil. And there's going to be a lot of conversation to try to find shared meaning around water.
Yeah, from previous discussions we've had, I know you have the model of how you think conversation progresses, and you've touched on two of those elements so far, the shared meaning aspect, and then looking at the what shall we do question.
Right. So from shared meaning we move into possibility, and possibility is a conversation that almost everybody loves to be in. We love to talk about what's possible. We often don't talk about what's possible from a base of shared meaning, so then we end up really going all over the place. But asking people what they see as possible is a very easy conversation to have at the beginning, because people love to brainstorm and go divergent. And then it becomes a difficult conversation to have, because at some point you have to stop being divergent and come into convergence. And so often you need a facilitator for that. Now that we've generated 50,000 ideas, we only have the budget to do 3 of them, right? So how are we going to sift through and sort out? If you've done a good job of creating shared meaning, the conversion portion of that conversation is much easier than if you haven't done a good job of that. So you come down to real world, okay, what do we have available in terms of time, people, resources, physical space, finances, all of that stuff. That we think based on that, these 1 or 2, maybe 3 possibilities could actually work. We can fund them and we can resource them to make sure they happen. And then you move into the third part of the dialogue, which is the coordination of action. And see, most people begin with part 3. They start with, okay, we have to do something, how are we going to make it happen? Instead of, we have to do something, what's it mean to us and what's possible? Now we move into, how do we make it happen?
And that's, as you've said before, that bit we know how to do quite well already.
We've got MBA programs out there that teach people how to do that extremely well. Develop a mission statement, develop a set of goals, develop a vision, figure out how to allocate resources and plan and set up timelines and check on things and how to handle breakdowns and flow and all of that stuff. There's lots and lots of people who know how to do that extremely well. My experience is that very few of them have the context of first creating the shared meaning and then exploring the possibilities before they attempt that. And that's one of the reasons that things break down all the time.
Because you've chosen to do the wrong thing, or
You're out of order. I say you're out of order. You know, it's not that you've chosen to do the wrong thing. You're starting on step 3 and you haven't done step 1 and 2 yet. And you know, in the 80s there was this book which I read a lot. I also have a lot of books that I haven't read, or books I've just read parts of. This is a book called Why Is There Never Enough Time to Do It Right, but There's Always Enough Time to Do It Over? Which sort of sums up the mentality of a lot of corporations. You know, constant push. We've got to make something. Make it happen, make it happen, make it happen. Okay, it didn't work, go back and do it again. Now, if we operate from there's enough time to do it right, but the time it takes to do it right means that we often don't start until 6 weeks after today, because between now and 6 weeks from now, we're going to be exploring meaning and exploring possibility.
Right. So it seems that the work that you did in Kansas is a really good example of all of this in kind of action.
Yeah, Kansas is a great example. I worked, my colleagues at Omega Point International, which is Stephanie Nesselrode, and she and her partner went into the Kansas Department of Social and Rehabilitation Services. Now this is a 6,000 person organization. They're responsible for running the state mental hospitals, for food stamps, for welfare, for unemployment insurance, for job retraining, for child protective services. I mean, it's a huge, sprawling organization. And you know, it's state-run. It receives federal funding as well as state funding, and it's very political because every time there's an election, the governor gets the chance to appoint a new head of that department. So you can have, you know, programs in there that are running really well, and the new person comes in and decides they don't like that program, and it can create it can throw a real wrench in things. So they're in a situation where they have been traditionally a command and control hierarchical organization. They've been very intervention based, you know, sort of by the book, and you know, this is how we do things. And that worked really well, or as well as it could have in the 20th century. But now, a lot of people who are senior there are at retirement age, so there's going to be probably 60 to 70% of the people will be retiring between now and 2015. So there's this huge brain drain going on. And younger people who are coming out of college now have been trained very differently. And they don't want to be in these, you know, silos and have a book that, okay, look up stuff and here's what we're going to do for this situation. No, they know the world doesn't work like that. You've got to be a lot more able to deal with emergence and what's going on in the moment. So to their credit, they allowed my colleagues to come in there and teach them some processes that weren't going to bear any fruit for at least 6 months. They told them flat out, they said, the first 6 months of our training, you're going to be pulling your hair out, you're not going to understand what's going on. And they actually taught them a lot of things like mindfulness, you know, and holding ambiguity, and you know, working with situations where there's nothing, where nothing is clear. And she was right. For the first 6 months, they're like, where are we? What are we doing? These people come here, they spend 4 days in a row, and they leave, and we walk around like, what did we just do? I'm really pleased that they got the opportunity to do that. You know, in my line of work, we often talk about change happening in biological time, because we have bodies, right? And bodies change in their own time. Anybody who's put on weight at the holidays knows that you don't make up your mind on January 1st, that on January 2nd you will drop 15 pounds, right? There's a lot of work between January 1st and April 1st when that weight is off, okay? Change happens in biological time. So they were given the opportunity to work with these folks, and they trained them in lots of large group processes. I was brought in to help them with World Cafe and Open Space. We worked with the top 55 managers of these 6,000 person organization, and we basically rewired their entire brains on how to approach things from a business standpoint of, you know, the traditional models aren't working, you need to try something new, and it's all based in conversation. You know, you've got to learn how to talk to people differently. You've got to learn how to step away from the old, you know, being protective of your resources, and instead start to learn the value of a network, that every individual is replaceable, but people who are key nodes in networks who know how to get things done are very, very valuable. And even people who don't seem to be very valuable in a network because they just know one thing, they can be connected to the right person, and all of a sudden they make a very great contribution. So we were going from a very command and control hierarchical to a much more distributed networked model, and it was all based around prevention rather than intervention. So what can we do in the short run that will save us money in the long run? And how do we keep people from burning out? Give them time off, give them vacations, give them stress reduction programs in the workplace. All the things that are starting to come out of the the great contribution to the human potential movement 40 years ago is that it's finally seeping into the mass consciousness that it's really good to take walks and to breathe deeply and to rest and to stretch and to eat healthy foods and drink lots of water and all the stuff that your grandparents knew that our generation kind of forgot is now sort of coming back into play.
Yeah, I just that's so ridiculous. I mean, that our organizations don't do that. I mean, that's a great case study of seeing it as a real, seeing the whole organization as a living entity that it needs to take care of itself so that it can do what it needs to do in the world and have healthy relationships both internally and with the community that they're serving.
That was another big piece of the Kansas work, was we started to really lean hard on them about being real, valuable member of the community. So it's not just that people look at social rehab services as the place to go when you're unemployed. They start to look at it as, this is a vital part of my community. And so we began a big listening program of them communicating directly with the members of their community, people who were getting welfare and food stamps, and they started to interview them and invite them in for surveys and questions and conversations about how can we serve you better, what would it be, what would make this system work for you. It was pretty much unheard of for a government organization to open up and ask their customers what their customers really needed. And there actually is a case study on this. Stephanie Nesselrode and Lori Alvarado, who was at the time the head of this project, have done case studies on this and presented at the Pegasus Systems Thinking Conference and a few other conferences. So I'm sure I can get you the information on that if you want to be able to check that out, because they've actually done quite a bit of detailing what was going on there.
It would seem that that's one of those things that would be a very good thing to do in many different places.
It would seem that, yes. Simple but not easy.
Yeah, I mean, so what this brings to mind for me is what you call wicked messes, and that what you do is about dealing with wicked messes. So maybe you should.
Sure. So as I've been developing this work over the years, one of the things that occurred to me was a lot of people are really great problem solvers, which is wonderful. We need good problem solvers in the world. But most people's default stance is to look at the world as a set of problems out there. And so when we see something like, just choose anything. We live in San Francisco, so we have a homeless problem. But is it really a homeless problem? It's actually a homeless mess. Now, problems, messes, and wicked messes are the terms that I use. And messes and wicked messes might sound whimsical, but they actually go back to, I think, the 1970s, and some German guys named Horst and someone else who, they kind of invented these terms. And basically, the distinctions that I use, which are very simple, they've got some very, they're German, so there's these really long things in Wikipedia around this, but the distinction is that a problem is something that is discrete, that can be solved, that once it's solved, you don't have to solve it again, and it shows up in certain domains, like there's in math there's problems, in logic there's problems, in rock climbing there's problems, in finance, in puzzle solving, stuff like that. One of the conditions of people who solve problems is that they love to talk to each other about how they're doing. Problem solvers love to talk to each other. But a lot of times we have problems that can't be solved. And that's an indication that we're actually dealing with a mess. So messes are systems where things are connected, but often invisibly. So something over here that is broken or that gets jiggled with affects something over there that doesn't show up for 3 months, and so there's these hidden feedback loops, and it requires a very different approach. You have to have a systems-based approach, so you need cross-disciplinary teams, you need systems modeling, and again, communication among people working on this tends to be very high because they love to explore what's going on. Now, Wicked Messes takes a mess and couples it with culture. And so when you've got different cultures who refuse to talk to each other or acknowledge each other's existence or even acknowledge the legitimacy of each other, then you have a wicked mess, because now you have all the problems that you have with a problem plus a system. So you have high systems complexity and you have high social complexity. And when you're dealing with a problem mindset is great. When you're dealing with a mess, a problem mindset is not great. And when you're dealing with a wicked mess, a problem mindset almost always makes it much more messy. And wicked in this case means highly resistant to intervention. It's not a pejorative term. It just means that it's really, there's all these dynamics in place that make it very, very resistant to change. And so what I've worked up is a way of approaching it that is not problem-based, but rather it's mess-based. And so in order to deal with a mess, you need to create intelligence. And my experience of working with large groups is that there are ways to create intelligence in large groups by asking the right questions and supporting them with the right process. Often I use something based on World Cafe. I do a lot of work with Peter Block's work from Community with Structure of Belonging. He uses people in clusters of 3. I run open space. I combine those. I use what I call small A appreciative inquiry, which is not the full, do and dream and design piece of the 4 steps in appreciative inquiry, but just kind of cherry picking from the best. David Cooperrider said in all of his work he discovered a couple of very important truths. One of which is that the most important questions you can ask are not what's wrong and who's to blame, but what matters and who cares. And that people grow in the direction of the questions that they're asked. So if you ask someone a question that makes them defensive, you're going to grow defensiveness. If you ask someone a question that is appreciative of their experience, that makes them cast their mind to a time when they succeeded and bring forward the lessons and the qualities, and you do it in a large group, you can generate a huge amount of intelligence in a very short time, and then you have a way to get that group to work together, thinking about new issues that they haven't had to deal with before from a real base of strength and creativity, that if you simply went in and dropped it in as a problem and said, analyze this and find a solution, you wouldn't get to.
That's really cool. Okay, I think, is there anything else you'd like to say?
Hi, Mom.
We have, it's 4 minutes, it's blinking.
4 minutes. I was going to tell you about stories.
Oh, stories.
A few years ago, a friend of mine asked me to run a group with about 50 peace activists and 50 business people. And this was right around the time of Mission Accomplished and the Iraqi War, and there's a lot of, it's in Silicon Valley, there's a lot of hard feelings about the war. And I didn't want to do it because peace activists tend to be very cantankerous folks. They're not usually open to hearing the other side, in my experience. But I went in and I was explaining how to graphic recorder. I said, this is Julie, she's going to be capturing our output. And someone said to me, you can't use capture, that's war language. That's how triggered this group was. So I managed to get them quieted down, and I said, what I'd like you to do to begin is to think about the first time that you realized that peace was important to you, and that it was going to be something that you would work on in your life. Because you're all here because you're interested in peace. The business people and the peace people are all here because you're interested in peace. And in the next 45 minutes, people did a couple of rounds where they were sharing what triggered, what that question triggered for them. And almost all of them went back to times when they were teenagers or in their early 20s and told these heart-wrenching stories of just profound moments of opening. What I would call spiritual opening, and by spiritual I mean simply a recognition of belonging to something larger than oneself. And after 45 minutes, the animosity in that room, which had been palpable when I walked in, had virtually disappeared. No one was made wrong for articulation of why they cared. And everybody actually appreciated hearing why people cared. And by the end of the day, we walked out with a group of people who had been at odds with each other coming in, saying, we're forming real partnerships here. We actually see how we can work together. And that's why I do collaborative conversations, because I like to get people who don't realize how much they have in common in terms of dreams and desires, to come together and say, hey, we're working together here. This is great.